I'm gonna hit record. Okay. So I'll turn it over to you, Sam.
Okay. Well, yeah. So I prepared. I wasn't quite sure what kind of turnout we were going to have. So I was talking to Gail earlier, and I said I was assuming, though I didn't want to automatically assume, but I figured it was a pretty good chance that our whole group was going to be white people. So, and that is how it's turned out. So, that's kind of how I wanted to start because, when I read Baldwin, I mean, I think he's a very powerful writer, and I like a lot of his fiction too. But just when we're reading something like this, I was telling Gail earlier, like I feel like, it can be difficult. I know I've struggled at times to talk about texts like this, like whether it be, in a classroom setting or, in a more casual setting. Just if you are a white person and you're talking to other white people about a writer like Baldwin, I think, like I was saying to Gail, sometimes we kind of, and I know I've done this, I mean, I don't want to speak for others, I'll just say what I've done. Like, we sort of fall back on platitudes. We sort of fall back on sort of easy, safe appraisals because, for the most part, if we're a relatively liberal, progressive group, we're probably going to agree with most of what, he's saying, like the substance of his argument. But it can sometimes be a little difficult to talk about it in depth because whether it's because we don't share certain experiences that he's had that he's talking about, or like I was saying to Gail, and I think it's been pretty well established by now that it makes us uncomfortable oftentimes, to talk about race and to talk about an author like Baldwin who's so unsparing with his language. So I was trying to figure out a frame that I could use for this, and it just got me thinking a lot. And I guess, again, largely because of what's been in the news lately. So I did want to talk about some of that. So I feel like Baldwin's very much speaking to a lot of these issues that we're still sort of grappling with today about education, history, American history, and like how we teach it, how we understand it, particularly how white people understand it. And then also just larger questions about identity, again, largely thinking about sort of white people's identity because he talks very specifically about that at a few points. So I just found a few passages that I thought we could kind of look at in the two essays. I mean, the first one really being more of a letter, but I just grabbed a few passages that I thought were interesting, and I just have some questions that I wanted to throw out there, see what you guys thought. But I kind of tried to approach this a little bit like kind of rhetorically, I guess, like thinking about the argument that Baldwin's making, because I do think he's got an argument. He's not just making observations. I think he's sort of giving us like a call to action, maybe at times. And he's at least recommending, if not sort of prescribing, certain actions. And I think sometimes he's talking about all people. And then I think at other times he's specifically talking about white people. And he's saying that there are specific things that white people need to do or that white people need to change in order for us to maybe make some progress with, our racial problems in this country. So I just kind of wanted us to kind of go through his argument and just kind of see what we think and how we respond to it. But yeah, since there's such a small group, we'll keep this very informal. I don't want to talk too much. So I'll just direct you guys to some of these passages and we can just talk about them, as much or as little as we want to. So if we start with My Dungeon Shook, he's writing his nephew, sort of offering his nephew some advice, I guess, some life advice. And I was struck by one thing he said when he tells his nephew that, the only thing that can destroy you is believing what white people say about you. Believing them when they say that you're inferior or, you're defective or whatever. And then Baldwin claims that, Baldwin's father, this kid's grandfather, fell victim to that. He says, you know, your grandfather believed what white people said about him. And it seems like Baldwin thinks that was obviously a big problem. So that was an interesting piece of advice. And then right after that, so I'm on page like 5. If you guys, I don't know if you guys have this same edition that I have, but this is page 5 in My Dungeon Shook. So this is kind of the first place where I felt like we were getting to one of his big points. And also it just struck me as something that seems really pertinent today with everything that's going on today. So I'll just read a little bit of this. It's kind of a little bit out of context, but he's talking about what what his own brother has sort of gone through, what, Baldwin's brother, this kid's dad, has gone through. And then he kind of segues into talking about the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen. You guys see where I am? Mm-hmm. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them. And this is the crime, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. Mm-hmm. So that was the first passage I flagged, just because I feel like he's going to keep coming back to this idea of, again, sort of at least what I thought of as like education and history, and the way we understand these things, the way we understand race, and the way white people either teach this stuff or don't teach this stuff. Just the idea that they do not know it and they do not want to know it. Mm-hmm. That just got me once again thinking about education, the controversy, the controversy with schools right now and CRT. So that's one passage, and I'll just go into the next one so we can just kind of do all of My Dungeon Shook sort of together because it's so short. So kind of earmark that. That's page 5. And then if we jump ahead to pages 8 and 9, another big claim that he's making, a piece of advice he's offering his nephew. He says that the mistreatment that his nephew receives, this is on page 8, the mistreatment his nephew receives from white people does not stem from anything the nephew has done or any lack on the nephew's part, but rather white people's, quote, inhumanity and fear. But then this is an interesting move that he makes at the bottom of page 8, right after he says that. He says, basically, nevertheless, you still have to accept them. You still have to accept white people and accept them with love. So I thought that was a really interesting passage starts at the bottom of page 8. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So that just struck me as a very interesting thing. And again, it just makes me think of what's going on today. And then if you keep going, it's kind of all of a piece over on page 9. I won't read this whole passage to you, but over on page 9, he keeps going. And he's talking about the reasons white people want to believe that blacks are inferior. And he says, at the top of page 9, many of them know better. But it's difficult to act on what you know. Okay, but then jump down to a couple of sentences later. He says, in this case, the danger in the minds of most Americans, most white Americans, I'm sorry, that's important. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on, he kind of creates a little scenario for, kind of tries to paint a picture for his nephew there. But that just struck me as really important. All the stuff that's going on there on pages 8 and 9. So I just wanted to put that out to you guys. Like, what do you think? Do you feel like we're sort of still dealing with these very things that he's identifying here, these questions about identity and this idea, really evocative how he puts it, like of white people being trapped, sort of trapped in their own history, not understanding their own history. Like, what do you guys think about some of that stuff?
Well, I see it in my own classes. If kind of make it a little bit personal, and the truth is, I'm cautious about, I'm talking about my my communications public speaking class, and I'm cautious about delving into those issues because the point of the class is to help students organize and present information, and I worry that sometimes we could be distracted, but at the same time distracted from that. But I also kind of feel like I'm kind of a little chicken, that I'm just afraid to go there.
Mhm.
And of course, my students, online students, it's a very integrated class. And I don't know, one of the things, I guess, seeing, looking at what the passages you've talked about, I'm struggling in a similar way in that class, for instance.
Yeah, I like what you said about kind of it's hard to talk about it's hard for me to talk about Baldwin because I feel like parts of the book are telling me I can't really understand as a white person, which I are probably very true. I'm not, I wouldn't contest that, but then it makes it difficult for me to engage because I'm like, how can I really engage except to say I'm learning about this perspective? I'm getting a new perspective that I don't have before, as far as I can get it. But I mean, he argues in the book, and this is a little later, where he's like, can I really understand jazz or the blues? I mean, can I? I don't know. I mean, I like the blues, but I mean, I feel like it's a difficult text for me to talk about because I feel like I'm immediately like kind of put off as like, you can't talk about this really. Does that make sense? It's like, I feel I'm kind of torn about whether or not he wants to discuss this with me, or like what I don't know, what I can. I guess it's just a struggle. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Well, and actually the point I missed making has to do with just what you're saying. But this passage, the worry of white Americans losing their identity, which is part of what people sort of falsely believe, I think, about CRT. But that's the thing that I worry about in my, typically pretty conservative classroom.
No, I'm definitely worried about that too. But Ethan, I wanted to put it to you because you are a historian. Like, do you agree with Baldwin when he says that white Americans are sort of trapped by their own history, that they don't fully understand their own history, or they kind of mythologize it? They kind of, because like later he'll talk about this again. I have another passage, I think, where he talks about like the fairy tales we tell each other, or we tell ourselves, the way we have to understand our history as being very heroic. And he identifies that as a major problem that I think he means white Americans specifically, because I think he's saying that Black Americans have a different history and a different understanding, at least, of history. But he seems to think that white Americans need to sort of, I don't know, do history differently in some ways.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what you thought about some of those claims.
Yeah. Well, I think that for me, I think, 1960s history education is different from.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially, and it's harder for me too, because like I've been to graduate school, it's like the people I'm talking to about history most of the time in graduate school aren't really like valorizing.
Yeah.
It's not the same as in some public history spaces, or, you run into someone who's like hardcore, like, Civil War buff, but they're like, it's just all about the battles. I mean, they're not really interested in race. They just want to talk about Grant and Lee and Lincoln. And it's kind of like, well, there is that strand, but I think, I mean, there's been a lot of great work done since the 1960s that that's really good work. So I think a lot of the issues still exist, but I don't think they're as prevalent as they certainly were. And I think this is 1962. I think this is right. So
62 or 63. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, this is like my mom's high school education was.
Yeah. My parents too. Yeah.
Pretty, and high school education is not everything it could be now, but I think it's better than 1962 probably in terms of being more inclusive and
on the whole.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of had this conversation before where we kind of said it's a lot better, but it also kind of depends on where you live, probably. Like it probably depends on what part of the country you're in.
Right. And we talked about like there's pushback in some places about how do you even refer to slavery? It's like it's enslavement of people. It's just what it is. It's not like they were just servants or employees. Like and the language matters, but and I think the movement, like even CRT having a lot of people talking about it, is itself a sign of progress. Even if there's push, there's it's conflicted discourse, but it's open and there's a lot of conversation. So I think that's all good. But
I want to acknowledge that we had Stephen join us, and I just see CL, so I'm not sure. But anyway, I just want to acknowledge you guys, and also just feel free to unmute and jump in anytime. We're pretty informal in this group, so if you have anything that you'd like to add, please do that. Ethan, I'm not sure if you were able to attend the Daniel Allen talk last night.
I didn't.
Well, that's okay. It's recorded.
I was so bummed.
No, it's okay. It's recorded and it'll be available. You can watch the whole recording. But one of the things she said, I thought of you, is that in the United States, I think she was referring to K through 12 education, but it might have just been high school. That 50 cents. On average, 50 cents per child per student is spent on STEM education, and 5 cents is spent on civics education. And so, her tagline was, "You get what you pay for," right? Which I thought was, so appropriate. So I think when I was reading that first section, and I tagged the exact same section, Sam, I just, I wrote, CRT, because to me, it's just, he could be writing this today about certain factions in our country that don't want to admit our history.
Yeah.
And don't want it taught. And that, that hasn't, I don't think that really has changed that much, that part of it.
Yeah, not in, certainly, again, not in certain parts of the country. Yeah, I mean, like where I'm from, like in South Carolina, there's a real anti-CRT fervor. I know it's not just in the South. I mean, Gail and I were talking about this earlier, but it's I would describe it for some as almost like a mania. Like it's like some people, like they're not just like worried about it. Like that doesn't do justice to the strength of their emotion. And yeah, I think Baldwin's right. I think it comes down to identity. I think for a lot of them, if we admit certain things or sort of, I don't know, foreground or highlight certain things more, it's like what Baldwin says later on that page. He says, for a lot of white America, the Black man has been this sort of pillar. It's been constant. Like, Black people's place in this country has remained somewhat fixed. And it's consistent and people are used to it. And I think to a certain extent, he's kind of saying it's a little bit like human nature. Like when you're confronted with a big change, he's kind of telling his nephew, anybody would be scared, like it's somewhat understandable when you think about how long things have been a certain way and now they're threatening to become a very different way. And that does scare people. I mean, that in any era, I don't think it matters what group you're talking about, that will scare people. But I do think that's kind of at the heart of it. People fear change. A lot of these people talk about how America's changing, and that's, to me, very lightly coded language, but They're like their fears and anxiety are very real. But also, like, you know, I want to be sure that we don't, you know, blame the education system, you know, for the problems that individuals might have. Like, my mom was a high school history teacher in South Carolina, so she would always say, you know, some of us do teach them the real history, but we can't guarantee that they are going to listen and or remember it. So, I mean, I think a lot of people who misunderstand or kind of get our history wrong or valorize certain things, it's not always because that's what they were taught.
Mhm.
That's just what they want to believe. You
Mhm.
know, like, they might be ignoring their teachers and believing this sort of alternative narrative. I know that's pretty common in the South. Like, and, you know, I knew a lot of kids whose parents just had this sort of inherent distrust of public school. So it's kind of like the way that they talked about the media. You know, they would say teachers are all liberals, you know, like they all skew liberal. So they're going to give you a liberal version of events. So a lot of parents would kind of almost try to reprogram their kids, like, outside of school, and be like, you know, we're going to tell you the real history, which is the kind of history that I think Baldwin's talking about. So I don't think it's certainly not teachers' fault most of the time. It's usually just parents or maybe some administrators. But yeah, anybody else have any thoughts about those early passages? We can also just look at how he wraps up the letter, because again, it's all kind of connected to what I think it's kind of like maybe his thesis, or like obviously a big part of his argument over on page 10. When he says, you know, we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are. So again, I take that to mean we Black Americans will force our brothers, white Americans, to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing reality and begin to change. So again, like Gail was saying, I think that can apply today as well. I think a lot of people are trying to flee reality and they don't want change. But then he kind of, over on page 10, and to me, he kind of comes back to this idea a lot at the very end of the letter. He says, we cannot be free until they are free. Mm-hmm. And he kind of returns to that idea later, this idea that white people have to change themselves to some extent, or they have to change their thinking. And we'll see some other passages like that before the race problem can be fixed. And he said, even in the film, you know, I'm Not Your Negro, he makes a similar point, I think, like, you know, once white people make necessary changes, like, the problem will kind of go away, like it'll kind of resolve itself. And I just don't know, I wanted to see what you guys thought about that, the idea that we cannot be free until they are free. The idea that white people have to free themselves from, I guess, misunderstanding, their hatred, other things he's already mentioned. Like, do you guys agree with that? Like, do you feel like that's an accurate way of putting it? Like, what do we think about that formulation? Like, the way he's expressing that? Like, is that kind of how we see it too?
Well, it's difficult. And I think back a couple summers ago, I was reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, mm-hmm. which I still am trying to grasp, because I mean, the point of that being that, you know, I've spent a lifetime saying I'm not racist, and I understand the distinction. And I don't know, I guess my struggle is sort of similar to what you're describing, Sam. Anyway, that's the thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with Baldwin that I think it has to happen across. You know, we know that race is a social construct, but it has to happen. You know, everyone has to, everyone has to be free in order for, one group to be free, right? And we know that kind of intellectually, but I don't know that we see that like in practice, even now. I don't feel like we do.
Yeah. Yeah, so he kind of makes the same point. If you guys flip over, so if we want to jump to down at the cross on page 22, near the top of the page, I feel like he's making a very similar point. At the very top of 22, he says, white people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other.
Mhm.
And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed.
Mhm.
So if you kind of place that passage in context, like previously, he's talking about sort of how to get people to treat you in the way that they themselves would want to be treated. And he says, you can't rely on goodwill. Really the only thing that can do it is power, right? If people believe that you have the power to punish them or take action against them for mistreating you, then they'll treat you better. But after he establishes that you can't rely on like Christian values or just the inherent good in people, it seems like he's offering sort of like a prescription, like if white people could do blank, then we could have progress, like we could have improvement. And here again, it's a pretty sweeping claim, even though his tone might be a little bit facetious, but just the idea that if white people could learn to love themselves and accept themselves, they wouldn't need to mistreat others who they perceive to be beneath them in the same way. Like they wouldn't have a need to.
Mhm.
So again, I know it's kind of hard to talk about this, but again, I feel like that's partly what he's trying to maybe highlight, is that like white people often maybe don't really think that they need to free themselves or love themselves, and he's saying that they do. that's sort of critical to fixing our racial problems. So I just wondered what you guys thought about that. Like, again, do we feel, like what do we think about these like recommendations? Like, do we feel like we should follow these, or do we think maybe he's like sort of speaking in hyperbole? Like
Yeah.
how do we take these?
For me, it's kind of with John. I read How to Be an Anti-Racist. I read Kendi's other book, The Definitive History of Racial Ideas. Probably in the last year, maybe it was a little more than a year ago, I read both those books, but I was just kind of left wondering a little bit about, I understand, like I said, it's like John said, like I get the distinction here, but sometimes I feel like the idea gets lost in beautiful prose. It's a beautiful prose, like, yeah, white people we all need to learn to love ourselves and each other. Like that's beautiful. It's just beautiful prose, but
how do we do that?
Yeah, that's, isn't that every religious discourse that's, or a lot of these, they motivate me to be a kinder person, but like, and I agree, like I think there's some great points there. Like you really can't just rely on the goodwill of the people.
Mhm.
Like there needs, when you're talking about, if you're going to move 350 million people and policy over those people, goodwill is often not enough. Like there's got to be something else, for that, because people don't always act in mass and goodwill, which I think is a really great point.
Mhm.
And it's beautiful prose. It's just hard to know what to do, like I'm enjoying the book, but I really think what I love about the book and what I loved about How to Be Anti-Racist and was and the who's that guy that writes The Atlantic that wrote Between the World and Me or something? You guys remember that book? Yeah, Coates. Yeah. I felt like the main thing I got out of those books was just understanding someone else's experience a lot better,
Mhm.
which might be kind of the point. And this book too, like Baldwin, I just feel like I feel like I understand his perspective so much better hearing more about his life story. And maybe that's the point, but I don't know if it's, you know, there's not like there's not, I don't know what to go outside. I don't know what sign to paint and where to go with it, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's kind of a lack of like practical specificity. Like he does kind of speak in these sort of with these like big ideas, but he doesn't always necessarily say, and here's how you can go about, you know, doing that. But
right, and it's beautiful moving prose. I love it because it's beautiful moving prose, but sometimes, you know, I just feel like this is beautiful,
Right.
but that's kind of as far as I get, you know.
Well, it's interesting, Ethan, because I'm thinking about it in the context of the time that it was written. And if you think about it, like Malcolm X and MLK and Baldwin, right? So Baldwin really, to me, as I'm reading this, and I was mentioning this to Sam, is that it's really jarring to be always referred to as a white person, you know, because that's not something that we experience very much, you know, in our culture where we get identified that way anymore. And so that's really helpful, I think, to read that in this context. And he's harsher than MLK, but not as harsh as Malcolm X. So for me, he's totally honest. I mean, he's honest about the depravity of Harlem. He doesn't sugarcoat it, which I feel like a lot of times the history that we get now about Harlem is all about how wonderful it was and the jazz, and you know, we don't get the gritty part as much in our retelling of that history. And so I really appreciate his honesty, but he's not easy. It's not easy to read because, you know, like I said, I'm not used to being called, you know, the white person all the time. And it's, and the other thing I was when you were saying about, you know, all the religions, that's like a major doctrine of Buddhism is, you know, what you wish for your enemy is that they would love themselves, because then they would stop hurting you. So you don't, and that's really what it comes down to is, you know, you want what's best for your enemy because it is what's best for you, ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to note, like the difference in time period, because I think nowadays, like we hear that language and it sounds almost like familiar because a lot of people kind of practice, like people promote loving yourself and like, you know, like that's kind of become, it's like a little bit of a self-help thing, but it's also kind of a religious thing. But like, I don't think a lot of people look at it through the lens that Baldwin's necessarily using. Like you hear that kind of rhetoric, like, oh, love yourself, believe in yourself, you know, be good to yourself, be kind to yourself. But like, I don't know. I don't think we often take the next, because like it's just like an all-purpose good thing to do. Like it's just going to improve your mental health, improve your physical health. You'll get along with people better. But I don't know that we always then think, and if I do that, I'll not be racist as much. Like, I don't know if that's like the logical thing that follows when a lot of people think about practicing, you know, like self-affirmation.
Well, is it a little bit of a contradiction for Baldwin to say like goodwill isn't going to do this, but we got to love each other? Like, it's like, I thought that wasn't, you know what I mean? To say like goodwill can only go so far, but we can't solve the problems until we all love each other, which is, I mean, we're not all going to love each other. That's just how, you know, the cynic in me is like, well, love each other. Yeah, it's beautiful prose, but I can also be like, but it's meaningless prose because that's not going to happen. Like,
well, is he saying love each other, or is he saying
love yourself and love each other? Even then, like, is everyone going to love themselves and love each other? Is that, I don't know if that's, do you know what I mean? It's kind of like he's made, it's a large, as an individual, that's very good, that's going to resonate with me. But if goodwill can only go so far in 350 million people, then, you know, it feels like maybe a contradiction. I don't know.
Well, maybe goodwill can only go so far because people aren't loving themselves, right? You know, so it's kind of, you know.
In our present situation,
right.
But if we change, and again, it seems like he keeps kind of calling on white people to change, and yeah, I think, yeah, often as you know, as I was reading it too, I was kind of saying, but how? Like, I mean, I acknowledge like the need to, the justification, but how do we do it? Like, how do we make people do that? How can I even make myself do that in some cases? So, yeah, he doesn't always explain that part, but he's certainly calling on us to sort of act and to change. And he keeps coming back to the idea that white Americans are sort of lacking in like self-knowledge. So we don't have to dwell on this passage for long, but on page 43, again, to me, it's all kind of just many examples that kind of support the same point. So like about midway down the page on 43, it's that long, about midway through that long paragraph, he says, it is the individual uncertainty on the part of white American men and women, this inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives. So again, that's another one of those phrases that I think you're talking about, Ethan, where it's like, it sounds good, but like, what does that exactly mean? Like what exactly is he identifying there? Then he goes on to say it's that inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives that makes white Americans sort of unable to like figure anything out or like understand things, see clearly. But I think that's another example of what we were just saying. Like, we might agree with the substance of what he's saying, but I'm not quite sure I know what renewing the fountain of yourself or whatever. I'm not quite sure I know what that means. So I'm not quite sure how to make the change that he seems to be calling for. But again, he kind of returned to this idea that white people don't really trust themselves. White people don't truly know themselves to a certain extent, I think. Then at the bottom of the page, he says, these attitudes, furthermore, though the person is usually unaware of it, they are historical and public attitudes. So on the next page, top of 44, he says, therefore, whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely and inexorably what they do not know about themselves. So again, I just feel like it's an interesting sort of way to make his argument. He's continually sort of turning the sort of lens back on white people. I mean, I feel like so many arguments about race, a lot of it comes down to what Black Americans need to do or aren't doing or should do or have to do. But Baldwin's really quite interested in sort of talking about, you know, like I said, what white people need to do or what white people are not doing currently. And yeah, that's an approach that I don't, again, like, you'd like to think that people would have an open mind, but I can't imagine a lot of, I mean, you know, a lot of people just wouldn't even finish the book. I feel like a lot of people would become personally insulted by some of Baldwin's, some of these claims that we're tracking, you know, but because he really is putting a lot of the responsibility on white people to change their perceptions, change their behavior. And like we said, a lot of people just don't want to do that. So anyway, we can move on. Like, I don't know if you guys wanted to talk at all about his experience as like a youth minister. That makes up a lot of the early part of Down at the Cross. And he eventually kind of denounces religion, you know. So I picked out the passage on 47, where we can look at that in more detail if you guys want to, but on page 47, he says, you know, if you really want to be a moral human, you first must divorce yourself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church. So, you know, that's a pretty bold denunciation. So I didn't know if anybody wanted to talk about his experiences in the church and, you know, just what a negative impact a lot of them seem to have on him as an adult. Like, what did we make of that? That was kind of an interesting part of the essay as well.
Hi there. I don't know if I'm going to cut out because of my internet connection. Maybe I'll keep the video off. It keeps saying my internet connection is very unstable. So I was very struck by this opening in particular, because we sort of get the beginning of Baldwin as he's in Harlem, and he's talking about being 14 years old and all of this. And then, yeah, he's a youth minister for, is it 3 years? I thought that was quite a length of time. And my question really is with the ambivalence here. It seems like there's a constant struggle that he's exploring because he dedicates a lot of pages to this, a lot of pages, really, really important to him in this narrative. And then, he mentions the sort of Jewish faith with his one friend that he gets slapped in the face by his dad. And then he spends a lot of time also with Elijah in Chicago, in the mansion, as it were. And he sort of kind of heavy-handed with the sort of leadership in the church, but he also indicts himself, doesn't he? He says it's that position of power that is the issue, right? With it, not in so many words is he talking about democracy. And of course, I got Danielle Allen on my mind, having listened to that talk yesterday, but not in so many words is he saying like, we're all on the same plane, but there seems to be this notion as you've mentioned a few times already, Sam, about love, right? We are brothers. There is this kind of repulsion against this kind of, Malcolm X perspective for Baldwin. He's like, no, God's black, the whites are white. And so it's this endless struggle. Wasn't there one passage where he said, Hitler and Malcolm X are shaking hands and talking about how they have so much in common. Isn't that ironic? But anyways, going back to this passage at the very opening, which I thought was very moving to me because of how sincere it was. And I think that's why Baldwin scores a lot of points with everybody across the divide. And I'll confess, I didn't quite trace the argument, Sam, that you've laid out for us. It's my first read, so I'm not really conversant in Baldwin. I don't know Baldwin that well, except for an essay that I taught in art class on creativity. He's brilliant in that regard. He's a brilliant writer. And I thought that part, if I could just back up for 1 minute, not to steal your thunder here, but I don't know how long I'll have internet connection. Right at the end of that, My Dungeon Shook, where you were pointing, Sam, he mentions that, James, his namesake, he's addressing his nephew, you come from a long line of great poets. He says some of the greatest poets since Homer, and then he quotes that sort of titular line for that section of the book. That very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off. I thought that was very poignant because that's how Baldwin finds his identity so many times. And we can return to that theme if you like with the writing. But I think that's why he sort of takes to this ministerial role, being in power. But I was just curious, just to open this up, how did you all take this idea of being saved? Baldwin seems to play on that notion, doesn't he? He's certainly appealing to the sort of Christian notion of salvation, and I don't know if it's orthodox or not orthodox. I mean, this is certainly he's getting into different aspects of Christianity, and he's kind of jumping from one thing to another. But that notion of being saved, as Gail was talking about, very much to the point, is Harlem was a place where, it's not it's not the glamorous Harlem of Bird, that we always think of the jazz, and that wasn't necessarily glamorous either, but, that the church in a big way saved him, he says, and so there's an ambivalence there. As you're pointing, he kind of leaves it, but I wonder to what extent he says it will never leave me. He says it's always going to be a part of me. I forgot where that was. I think you all know the passage I'm pointing to there. He said it's made a huge impact on me. I'll never feel the way that I did. Ethan was talking about the blues and the jazz that I feel when I'm in the church, and there's that experience, of people singing and the gospel and so on. And it's kind of like jazz and blues, and he brings it all in. It's a very cultural thing. Anyways, I just wonder to what extent we can open that up, that idea of being saved for Baldwin personally, and his narrative, his journey, his finding himself in this great narrative as well as in a spiritual sense, because to my mind, at least, and I can expand on this perhaps, it seems like a lot of these core ideas that we're tracing do have roots in Christianity, regardless if he's, ad hominem attacking that ministerial position, of the guy who lines his pockets, gets the Cadillac, gets the mansion, and so on. Not just that, but anyway, in any event, I'll open that up. That idea of being saved to me was very interesting, and a question that I'll throw out there. But thank you for this event.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah. So it almost seems like the church saved him from the dangers of Harlem, but I don't know if it doesn't seem like he really accepts the idea of spiritual salvation. But just from a practical standpoint, I think because he was in the church and because he took on this role, it seems like that probably kept him from maybe getting in trouble. Just not to be too simplistic, but he mentions a lot of his friends kind of get caught up in drinking and sort of carousing at an early age and drop out of school, and obviously he doesn't follow that path. So yeah, it seems like religion does help him in that regard, but it also reminds me of the whole idea of being saved. I don't know if you guys have ever read this essay by, speaking of the Harlem Renaissance, written by Langston Hughes. It's called Just Salvation. It's in an essay. It's in a book I use in 101. I make my 101 students read it, and it's a first-person narrative about him as a child going to church, and he's supposed to be saved, but he doesn't really feel it. They're having a revival. In his auntie's church, and he goes and he claims to have seen Jesus just to appease the adults, but he doesn't really feel it. Young Langston doesn't really feel it, so he feels great guilt afterwards. So like Baldwin, he very much grows up in the church, but seems to be kind of having a crisis of faith, which it seems like Baldwin has also experienced. So it just made me think of that essay by Hughes.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, too. That idea of being saved. I like the way that he kind of, he's pretty harsh against both Elijah Muhammad's community sometimes, and also the church. But he does kind of also acknowledge. He seems to have a lot of understanding for both, which I really like about his perspective. When he goes to see Elijah Muhammad, he's pretty he's pulled into the experience, the way that he talks about talking to him and the people at the table and agreeing with him, and how then he's going to get taken by the driver to a white person's house, and how he's kind of he doesn't buy into everything Elijah Muhammad says, but he still has that feeling of these people think I'm going to enemy territory, and maybe I am. He's still kind of a little bit I don't know. And like I said, he's I'm never gonna. He's there's something about the church that you just can't get anywhere else. He's still, he has. I like that balance in him, that he's able to see things that he likes, but also speak very directly about how Malcolm X and Hitler are similar. That's pretty. It's a pretty strong language, but to still understand where people are coming from is. I think that's part of the power of the essay that he's writing here.
I found that passage that you were referring to, Stephen. I think it's on page 33, that first full paragraph on 33, and he says, "The church was very exciting. It took a long time for me to disengage myself from this excitement. And on the blindest, most visceral level, I never really have and never will." And he goes on to say, "There's no music like what you have in church. There's nothing that can equal that." So yeah, he goes into depth about that there. So I think that's what you were talking about.
Well, and the essay feels kind of like a sermon. I feel like it does feel.
Yeah, he is a preacher.
Yeah. You feel like he's preaching a gospel to you while you're reading it. To me, anyway.
Yeah, and a lot of religious language. It runs throughout. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Baldwin's father was a minister as well. So yeah, he was literally raised in the church.
Yeah, I guess, I read so much of that as his disenchantment with the dogma of the church, not the spiritual connection that he felt in the church. Because what he's talking about with that connection with other people, when they are being moved by the Spirit,
Yeah.
and he is in contact with that, he's being moved by the Spirit. I mean, there is that. It doesn't have to be in a church. It could be in a jazz club when there is that collective spiritual, being moved spiritually by something that elevate, above, otherworldly or inhuman. I don't know what it is, but so I guess that's what I latched onto, was his disenchantment was with the church and with the dogma, not with the spiritual aspect of his religion.
Right. Yeah, I think so. But I mean, just to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier, like some of the struggles in the class, like when I teach that essay, Salvation by Langston Hughes, like I try to explain, because like my students don't really quite understand like what's going on in the church. Like I tell them it's a revival meeting, but like, I don't know, like I make them Google it, but then like I'm trying to explain certain things about like an African-American church, it gets a little awkward because I don't have a lot of African-American students. Most of my students are white or, Latino. So like, I'm sure some of them do have some knowledge about it, but it's just like, I feel like a very imperfect vessel. Like I'm trying to convey this information. I've never stepped foot inside an African-American church myself. I've seen stuff about, I've seen like stuff on film or like read about it. But I have no firsthand experience in the kind of thing that Baldwin's describing. So again, when you're a white educator trying to explain things like that you just feel so, I just feel very unqualified or almost unable to really explain. Because again, I'm trying to kind of explain how it's a little different maybe than what some white people might experience at church. Like not totally, but I mean, there are some differences, like cultural differences that if you're like Catholic or like a white bread, like Presbyterian or Methodist, like my people, like church isn't like that for you. Like you don't like, it's just a very different kind of experience. It's hard to convey that sometimes.
I did really like what Gail brought up about talking about MLK and Malcolm X and Baldwin kind of on a spectrum. And I think that helps. I think that helps understand. It helps me think about the book, partly because like the PBS had that documentary recently about the Black church in American history. I don't know if you guys saw that, but it was like really like praising, in many ways, kind of like talking about how important Christianity has been historically for African Americans. And I feel kind of like in some ways like you can also look at this kind of as an internal debate a little bit between like kind of like MLK voices, which are very in the church, Baldwin voices, which are not. And then you have like Malcolm X as part of Islam, and he has this whole other journey, but it's as an internal dialogue. I mean, as a historian, that's fascinating to me, because it's sometimes it's like Baldwin is speaking, and I'm like so pulled in that I'm just like, this is the African American voice, because as an I don't know as an outsider, like it's hard to really know what the internal debates are as an outsider to any community, you know what I mean? But I do feel like if thinking about those three characters specifically, you get a pretty good sense for the range that people are approaching this similar problem with, and that to me is really fascinating. So yeah, I think that was a great comparison, Gail. I'm glad you brought it up, because that kind of pulls me out of this thought of like, when I'm reading this kind of author, of just thinking like, oh, this is the voice, you know what I mean? And I'm just kind of like trying to learn from this one person and be like, oh yeah, well there's a lot of voices
Right.
And I think that helps.
I
And
think
like my understanding, I'm no expert on this, but my understanding is that Malcolm X later in his life, I don't think he rejected all of the teachings of Nation of Islam, but he did sort of,
Oh no, yeah, he was
he
and Elijah
moderated.
Muhammad. Yeah, they weren't
Yeah,
friends at the
he
end.
severed ties, right? He severed
Yeah.
ties with Elijah Muhammad. Yeah, he came to repudiate a lot of the same views that Baldwin's repudiating here.
Yeah.
You know, later in his life, I think it was after he went to Mecca.
Yeah.
Back and said, I saw so many different people there. You know, like white people and black people and everything in between. So it kind of really kind of had a different perspective. But of course, he was, I think, assassinated soon after, so he didn't have a chance to really write about it a ton. But if you guys want to, we can jump over to that passage, that scene really where he goes to visit Elijah Muhammad on the south side of Chicago. So this is like around page 70, I think, or like a little before that when he arrives.
So yeah, guys, I have to duck out.
I'm sorry.
I have to duck out, but I wanted to say thanks. I'll see you.
Great. Thanks,
Bye, John.
Thanks for
Good
joining
to
us.
see you.
But yeah, this scene just kind of reminded me almost like of a scene like in a novel, you know, like I felt like a little like Baldwin's a little bit of his fiction writing came in handy here, because he really paints a nice scene here as he arrives at the mansion and this whole interaction with Elijah Muhammad. Yeah, it's very cordial. He seems to like Elijah Muhammad sort of like on a personal level and sort of admire him. But yeah, it's interesting that he just doesn't buy their ideology. Like he's just not really interested in adopting their belief system. But he feels almost a little bit sheepish about feeling that way. Like, you know, it's like he doesn't like want to disappoint them, I guess, or you know, be, you know, confrontational. But and like we can talk about anything that y'all want to about this scene, but there was just one thing I highlighted because I thought it was a really perceptive take at the top of page 73. So like he's thinking to himself like, well, I don't hate all white people, like, you know, because like they're saying, you know, all white people are devils, and he's rejecting that. And he's kind of thinking like it's really interesting how he depicts this, because he's like in his own head and he's thinking to himself like, how could I maybe make the case to them that I actually know some decent white people? So at the top of 73, he's like, I almost say, well, take my friend Mary, and very nearly descended to a catalog of those virtues that gave Mary the right to be alive. But what he says earlier than that is, in the eeriest way possible, I suddenly had a glimpse of what white people must go through at a dinner table when they are trying to prove that Negroes are not subhuman. And just when I read that line, it just, like, I have some racist relatives that I have had to sometimes eat with and talk to. And that's just like, that very scenario has played out. I've seen racists try to tell people that they're not racist because, you know, it's like that old cliche, like they have like the one black friend or like one black coworker or whatever. But I think he's just making the point that like, again, like he likens in some ways the ideology of Elijah Muhammad to the ideology of a lot of white racists who just sort of essentialize and make this blanket statement about an entire race. And he can't bring himself to do that. You know, so he almost feels like the white liberal at the table, like trying to defend. I think that's the way the point he's making is like, he's more in the role of like the white person defending black people to a table of less enlightened white people. And he's like, no, I don't want to do that because it's kind of futile. Like, I'm not going to change their minds. But I thought that was interesting how he characterized that as like kind of like this role reversal, you know.
I was just going to respond to CL. She said, thanks everyone for the opportunity to hear your thoughts. I'll be back at another time when my technology is improved. Well, thank you, CL, for she runs.
I think they left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she's joined us once before. I recognize the name,
But then he kind of ends that paragraph by saying, if he had said that about his friend, his white friend, then Elijah and the others would have nodded their heads solemnly and said, well, she's all right. but all the others, you know. And again, I just
Right.
think I think we've probably all heard that kind of language before. So yeah, it's interesting that he's able to identify. I mean, I guess it's not, I mean, he's obviously very smart and perceptive, but again, maybe a somewhat surprising rhetorical move that even though he personally seems to like Elijah Muhammad, and he obviously admires kind of what they've done, how self-sufficient they are, but he just can't accept that kind of essentializing ideology, because he makes this point later, because that's kind of what white people do, like, right, like like that's kind of the way white people think, just like the inverse of that. So he rejects it, yeah, and he's not all that interested in it.
Yeah, I can think it goes back to what Ethan is saying before about, I think what I found so refreshing about his voice was, even though it did feel like a sermon, it didn't feel preachy at the same time, because I felt like he wasn't, it wasn't a, there wasn't a binary on it. It wasn't like this is right and this is wrong. Even though he kept saying, you know, the white people, you know, were the root of a lot of the problems, but his openness to all these different perspectives mitigated that for me, in a way that made it much more palatable, I guess, and something that could have been much harder to read.
Yeah, something I really liked from that too is when he talks about his visit with Elijah Muhammad and his followers, how he's kind of like, he points out that, like, based on their experience, what do you expect them to believe about white people? You know, he's not, and that to me, like I said, I think the real value, what I really enjoy about the book is really just kind of getting a better understanding of, you know, this is why they believe that. This is their whole experience. You know, if you grow up in Harlem and this is your experience with these white police officers, you're only dealing with these white police officers. Like, James Baldwin is in a different situation than a lot of these people, because he is able to write his way out of Harlem. So he's got, you know, he's dealing with different, he's got a broader circle than a lot of these people who are following Elijah Muhammad may have. And it makes total sense that they would think this way. And you're like, yeah, of course they think, of course that's how they feel, you know? And I think that to me is like, you know, that I just really like getting that perspective, because it's like, sometimes like, oh, well, these people are just crazy. You know, they're just following, like, they're like, this is, it's, you know, it's kind of out there when you hear that kind of rhetoric about Elijah Muhammad's like, you know, all white people are devils, and his whole theory about God's going to wipe out all the white people really soon and stuff. You're kind of like, this is getting a little bit wild, you know? Why would people believe this? They're like, well, their whole experience is this, you know?
Yeah.
And he points that out in a very sympathetic way that makes you as a reader be a little more sympathetic toward, like, these ideas might sound outlandish to you, but they're not outlandish if you grew up where I grew up.
Right.
You know? And I really, anyway, that resonated with me as a reader. So.
And that's a great point about Baldwin. Yeah, because like he's going to meet a couple of white friends in a different part of town after he leaves Elijah Muhammad's house. And then he's kind of embarrassed. Like you said, but he knows that they know that they're taking him to a white address, because they can just tell by where he's going in the city, like, oh, well, that's white people. Like, you're going to hang out with white people. But yeah, Baldwin does have white friends largely, yeah, because he's a writer and because he's traveled in these like literary and artistic circles. And yeah, I think you're right. I think most of the followers of Elijah Muhammad have probably not ever been much outside of the South Side of Chicago, you know, and like they probably haven't had the same opportunities to broaden their social circle. Maybe some have, you know, and then Elijah Muhammad saw his own father murdered by white people. So yeah, it's like based on their experiences. Yeah. And Baldwin can certainly relate to that, coming from a similar background. But yeah, he leaves that place. Yeah, he gets out of Harlem. And so his whole worldview kind of broadens, yeah, in the ways that not everybody's can.
Well, and he brings up that interesting thing too about how Elijah Muhammad's doctrine is like helping people in prison. Like, they do reform their lives. Like, they, you know, there's good coming out of this. Like, they change their behavior. They stop they stop a lot of things based on this religion that
Yeah, they are about uplift. Yeah.
right, yeah, and they are uplifting themselves, you know, in that way.
Yeah.
And it's like, and so it's yeah, I just, he's very, like I said, he's got strong language about the doctrine and that is very like condemning of the doctrine, but he's also kind of admiring Elijah Muhammad and very understanding of like why this is happening. And that's a good line to walk, I think, for a writer. He does a really good job with it. I mean, he's an incredible, obviously he's incredible. I haven't read anything else he's written, so I was really impressed.
But I feel like that whole scene, it just kind of, and then if you keep going, like he kind of comes back to this point that he's made before, but now he kind of makes it even broader, because like part of the reason he rejects them, I think, is because he doesn't believe their version of history. You know, like he feels like that's that like their version of history doesn't line up with the facts for him. So on page 81, he kind of talks about this, and he says that, you know, earlier we saw that he said white people have to accept their history, but now on page 81 he says the American Negro can have no future anywhere on any continent as long as he is unwilling to accept his past. So he's saying now that Black Americans have to also accept their history, and it seems like he's saying that's what Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam are not doing. Like they're creating a different, like, alternative history that they like better. And he says, no, that's not going to fix the problem. Like, you have to accept it as it is. And then he says, that doesn't mean you have to drown in it. It means you learn how to use it. So again, I feel like as harsh as he can be at times, this is another one of these moments where, you know, he's saying, you know, we all have to do this. Like, he's not singling out one person or one group. He's saying we all have to accept our history. If we want to grow and sort of get better, you know. And the Nation of Islam's not doing that, you know, so he rejects them. A lot of white people aren't doing that, so he rejects them. But again, he's kind of an equal opportunity rejecter. Like, he's not only hard on white people. Yeah, I mean, he'll turn his criticism on African Americans too in certain cases. That, you know, we have to be real about it too. We can't make up an imaginary history either. And I think that's a, you know, that probably lends him some more credibility as a, you know, in terms of his argument, because he's consistent. You know, everybody has to do this. Some things maybe mostly white people need to do, but in this case, everybody has to do it. So I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, Sam, that's a really good passage. Can we read that passage out loud, actually, to sort of get into it a little bit? I thought that was actually the real heart of the book, especially after that climax, as he leaves Elijah Muhammad and says he's sort of left unresolved. You know, he wished he could love him. You know, he felt like he'd let him down like his dad. Like, it's really kind of a deep moment. They're having dinner together, you know, in the frame of a narrative. It's really beautifully crafted. He spends a lot of time sort of describing that scene. But then as he leaves, as you point out, on the way to some white people's house, who he's afraid to tell the address for, he has this real deep sort of aside on history. And would you mind reading it, the entire passage there, maybe starting at that part where he's talking about, or I can read it if you like, about the brothers. It's my pagination isn't the same as yours, but
okay, have at it. Yeah, go ahead and read it.
Yeah, if I might. Okay, thanks. So in the meantime, he could walk the streets and fear nothing, because there were millions like him coming soon now to power. There's that theme again of power. He was held together, in short, by a dream, though it is just as well to remember that some dreams come true, and was united with his brothers, in quotation marks, on the basis of their color. Perhaps one cannot ask for more. People always seem to band together in accordance to a principle that has nothing to do with love, a principle that releases them from personal responsibility. Yet I could have hoped that the Muslim movement had been able to inculcate in the demoralized Negro population a truer and more individual sense of its own worth, so that Negroes in the northern ghettos could begin in concrete terms, and at whatever price to change their situation. But in order to change a situation, one has first to see it for what it is. In the present case, to accept the fact, whatever one does with it thereafter, that the Negro has been formed by this nation for better or for worse, and does not belong to any other. Not to Africa, certainly not to Islam. The paradox, and a fearful paradox it is that the American Negro can have no future anywhere on any continent as long as he's unwilling to accept his past. To accept one's past, one's history is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. How can the American Negro's past be used? The unprecedented price demanded, and at this embattled hour of the world's history, is the transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars. Anyway, the boy said suddenly, and then he sort of continues on. I just thought that was really poignant there. And sort of brings a lot of the ideas together that you were stringing along very well, Sam, as it goes throughout the book as in terms of history. But yeah, there's a little bit of a development and a different flavor to it here.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for reading that, Stephen. It does feel like, the theme is embracing paradox, and holding the paradox, and that nobody, whether it's black or whites, nobody seems to really want to do that. Everybody wants a scapegoat. Everybody wants somebody to blame, and that hasn't changed. Unfortunately, that part hasn't changed throughout history. But maybe that is the magic of Baldwin, is that he does seem to be able to hold that paradox, the tension of that. Maybe that's what comes through.
There's an artist that I've been researching pretty closely for a couple of years now named Charles White.
Yeah.
He was a big student of Alain Locke and Arthur Schoenberg and a lot of historical writers from the 20s and 30s, Harlem writers, who talked an awful lot about history and incorporated history in artworks. And this is also sort of inspired the art of several followers of Charles White, like Kerry James Marshall, probably the biggest well-known African-American artist today. And these fellows, unfortunately, had pretty much been thrown to the wayside until a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, when the New York Times ran a big article on Charles White and said, look at this amazing painter and so on. He was thrown to the wayside because he recovered the past, because he squarely represented the past and made people very uncomfortable, but also very honest, and it was pushed against by the establishment, the curators, whether they're white or black, because it didn't fit the narrative of the ascendant sort of New York school and abstract expressionism and things like that, stuff that Baldwin, with his writing was very in dialogue with, I think. So anyways, I think this has a lot of much larger resonances, and again, it's it's inclusive in a capital I real sense of the term. We're brothers. This isn't so much about what they need to do, what I need to do, what you need to do, what we all need to do. No. This is more about what we need to do. And I think that's why perhaps, we have this sort of very short, tender letter, appended to this very long and brilliant essay to his nephew, where he makes that point and says, well, you're a poet, you can join into this. This is a creative enterprise. We are a part of this. And to me, it's very inspiring. And I think you were pointing to that earlier, Sam. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And I could be wrong, but I think Baldwin's quoting himself there. Isn't that, aren't those lines from one of his own works in that letter when he's talking about the greatest poets?
I wondered, you mean that?
Know where that actually comes? I'm not sure if I know exactly where that comes. I thought
I'm
that was
not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what it does remind me of is another artist, and that's probably just my art brain. But Romar Bearden If you haven't seen it before, look it up on your
Right.
computer. It's called A Black Odyssey. And it's the most brilliant exhibition that was going on. I think Columbia University had it for a while. And it's just the most brilliant adaptation. And I wouldn't say adaptation, I'd say a very faithful rendition of the most classic epic work of what we would think of as the white man's history. But Romar Bearden is like way transcending this stuff and being like, no, man. The Greeks were black. I mean, go back to it. You know, Malcolm X was a huge student of the Greeks too. He loved Aesop. And he read the whole Greek anthology in prison. Why he was such an eloquent orator, as was Frederick Douglass and so many others. I'm sure Baldwin dabbled a little bit with classical learning as well. He's so brilliant in his writing. But Romar Bearden brilliantly talks about how, just like in this passage that Baldwin is bringing up, that this history, something that sort of transcends the sort of color and the kind of maybe segregated ways our minds tend to think of these issues as a much bigger sort of thing. You know, being an American, one doesn't fit in almost anywhere else. In fact, I quote Baldwin, I quote the Yankees, I quote, some song I heard on the radio. And guess what? We all do that. And I quote Homer too. And that's American, and that's Baldwin. And I think, to bring another Harlem artist into this, Romar Bearden, I think, is a tremendous figure, a sort of giant, really, in the art world that resonates very greatly with this.
Yeah, and I mean, like part of, just to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier with some of the present day kind of connections, like part of what really bothers me about so much of the debate that you hear now and so much of what you hear from the right is this idea that to be critical or just to want to understand like the true history is to somehow hate America or to somehow want people to feel shame. And like, I don't get that. As angry as Baldwin can sound and seem sometimes, I never get the sense that, I mean, yeah, like it's like you just said, I think he takes kind of some pride in all of us as Americans doing things together and creating some kind of improved state of being. I don't get the sense that he hates America. I don't get the sense that he hates white people. And in fact, he's pretty explicit that he doesn't, and that's just partly what bothers me about the ways that a lot of people try to shut these debates down, to kind of accuse you of not being patriotic or to accuse you of, misrepresenting your country, when in reality, I feel like we're doing the very opposite of that, and to truly love your country is to be honest about it,
Yeah. And I would point out too, Sam, that there are conservative Black people. I don't think it's a political sort of issue so much. This is it's a large, not all Black people are liberals.
Well, no,
this is
but
much larger.
It is kind of a political issue right now. I mean, it does kind of fall along political lines.
Yeah, I have to catch up on all that. I'm not really familiar with what CRT necessarily entails and what the objections are to it, and all the details and things, so why it's so controversial. But that would be interesting to find out on my part.
I do think one thing that to me, like as a historian, that comes up a lot, that I don't know, I always kind of like the salvation through history thing. It's a theme that comes up often, and history's a mess, man. It's not, I haven't really, like when somebody kind of turns to my discipline is like, if we tell the history of the United States, I'm like, there is no the history of the United States. Like, what are you talking about? There is historical information and historical interpretation is essential to any community and any nation and its conception of itself. But I mean, it's kind of like when you go through graduate school and then you hear someone say the history of something, you're just like, it kind of bugs me. I mean, it doesn't I'm always like, I agree with Baldwin in many, but like the history, if we figure out the history, I'm like,
but can it be just that we have to accept the messiness? Like, we don't have to make it clean, but we just have to accept it in all of its messiness, all of its complexity.
Well, we have to find, to me, it's about finding the right narratives that are important. I mean, it's not because as people are going to fight about history forever,
Right.
because there's competing, like history is a bajillion facts that we string together into narrative structures.
Mm-hmm.
So people are going to say their structure is true because they have true facts in their structure that create a narrative arc.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't argue with that. Like, yeah, this is a true narrative arc that you found because it's based in fact. The narrative arc is an invention.
Mm-hmm.
We have to have narrative arcs in the past, but,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, it should be, America is a multicultural place, so we need to have multicultural narrative arcs that,
Right.
that encompass multiple people's experiences. But like the history wars that go on, to me, are not always mutually exclusive, and they're often not. Like, it's like, you know, I read this whole biography on USS Grant that was like 40 hours of me listening to this book. Fantastic biography.
Mm-hmm.
And then I read Kendi right after that about the history of racial ideas in America. And he tries to rip on Grant. And I know a lot about Grant because I just listened to him for 40 hours. And it's like, I felt like, I mean, sometimes I felt like Kendi's trying to say that book is wrong. I'm like, well, look, this is a very good biographer, a very faithful rendering of Grant. And I now have some respect and admiration for Grant. But they can both, I can listen to both stories basically. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like a conservative voice more likely to be like, hey, I love Grant and don't listen to Kendi. And I'm like, well,
Right.
you can love Grant and still listen to Kendi.
That's right.
And just balance it. Anyway, it's just kind of messy to me. It's not as simple like we need to recover the true history,
That's right.
like the Holy Grail, and then all will be saved. I feel like we need to validate different interpretations and listen to all kinds of interpretations, which is what I like about Baldwin. Is it's a new, fresh voice that is I can learn from this person. You know,
That's right. It reminds me of when
that
we
was kind of a tirade. Sorry.
No, Ethan, it's great because it reminds me when we were reading Cast, and one of the things Wilkerson says is, is that our country is like an old house. Remember when she uses that analogy, and that you can love an old house and still acknowledge that it needs work and it needs,
Right.
and there's and the foundation might be really like crumbling, but you can still love it. You don't. It's that whole like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing, and we've just gotten to a place where we're so polarized where it's everybody, because of fear is we feel like we have to have this one stance and stick with it and be unyielding, and it goes back to another conversation that we've had in the past too about how we perceive vulnerability in our country, and how vulnerability is not perceived as a strength, it's perceived as a weakness. And so by holding the paradox, right, by holding both sides, and embracing the messiness, that's seen as a weakness because you're acknowledging that,
Right.
that there is not one clear, definitive truth. And that's a vulnerable stance.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
yeah, there was a lot of things I thought of, reminded me of things that she had talked about in Cast when I was reading this. And it makes me, after having read Baldwin, it makes me want to read African-American criticism or examination of his work. And I was telling, I know we have to leave pretty soon, but I was telling Sam earlier, I listened to this not very long interview. It was on Being with Krista Tippett, and she interviewed Trayvon Shorters. And I wasn't familiar with his work, but he coined the term asset framing. And basically, in a nutshell, it's what you're talking about, Ethan, is that we have to change the narrative. We have to change the language that we use when we talk about, even like the term marginalized. We have to change all of that, because what we are doing, whether it's through media or just through, on a smaller scale or a large scale, is that we are, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Is that we are continually to create this deficit mindset for certain groups of people. And it's just fascinating. I'm not explaining it well, but I recommend it. I'll send you the link if you're interested.
Yeah, send it to me. Yeah.
Because to me it was like, yeah, it made so much sense. And he gave one example of, he worked as consulting with a media firm in LA, and they had written an article about how the Latinx community was adversely, dramatically affected by COVID. And that was what led the article, right? So he said, let's write it this way. And he started the whole article with all the assets of the Latinx community in this certain area, all the things they had done, all the things they had achieved, all the growth they had done in a short period of time, and all the positive things. And then he said, and even so, as a result of COVID, they've been the hardest hit. And it was like a completely different take. Like all of a sudden you weren't blaming the victims. You weren't saying, well, that, somehow it changed your whole perspective of like how, for me anyway, it was like, oh, right. These are people who are adding so much to their culture and to their communities and everything. And why is it that they're being so adversely affected? Do you know what I mean? So it was the language and the reframing. I think when you touched on that reminded me of that, of just like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just kind of, I guess to me, it's kind of about trying to add narrative. As a historian, my goal is try to add narrative thoughts to people's minds instead of, like the Civil War, like the kid in my class who just studies Civil War battles and wants to talk about Grant and Lee and not about race.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like there's that, but it's kind of like, I don't necessarily want to sit there and I don't want to fight about the Civil War with that kid, or I don't want to go in there and say, that's not American history, because it is American history. It's a pretty narrow strand but it is. And everything he's talking about is true. Those battles happened.
Yeah.
There was heroics and there was tragedy, but really just to try to add some new narrative ways of thinking that, like, what if we thought about Latinx people as not marginalized? What if we thought about them as central to this community and retold the story? And then you're just kind of adding to, instead of combating their history and saying like, you're wrong, you're just saying, look, you're right in this part of the past. You're talking about Grant and Lee, cool. But let's add a new narrative story. And that's what I think that's why I liked what you said about Baldwin and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, is it's adding a different narrative approach to that problem that was really valuable for me. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's great too. But I mean, and what I was kind of the point I was trying to make, I was going to respond to Stephen again before you left. But yeah. I mean, I don't think we can avoid the fact that a lot of people right now are trying to stop the teaching of history. Like a lot of people are trying to prevent certain historical narratives from being told.
Right.
Now, I know it's not everywhere. And I know it's not the same everywhere, but it's a real thing that's happening. And I just feel like a lot of people are kind of treating it like it's not really a big deal. And I don't know. It seems like a very big deal to me. And
that's true.
Yeah, no, it's huge. And I think, back to the Danielle Allen talk about the 5 cents on civics, this is what happens if we don't teach, our history, right? Is that we get to these places that we are at right now.
We need a broad, diverse history for a broad, diverse community. That's and people trying to whitewash history or
right.
That is something that's worth fighting for. You know what I mean? It's
And I know it makes people squeamish, to sort of make it political. I guess that's what Stephen was saying. But I mean, to me, how can you say it's not political? I mean, it's not Republicans and Democrats who are passing these bills that can restrict what teachers say in the classroom. That's only Republicans that are doing that. Like that's not a thing that everybody is engaging in. That's one party who's made it a very specific part of their platform. It's completely political. And and the states where it's going to happen the most are going to be Republican majority states, or states where the Republicans control the legislature. Like that is already happening. Like they're already passing these bills in places like Georgia and Florida. Texas, like virtually any red state has the power to do that
Right.
stuff. It's completely political, and it just bothers me. Like, I mean, I didn't want to get into an argument with Stephen,
Yeah.
but like, it's like, if it's not, like, how is it not? I just don't get when people say it's not political. Like, of course it is. Like, Republicans have made it one of their central issues is to push
Right.
back on CRT. Like, it's just, I'm not saying all Republicans feel that way, but like, that's a part of their party now. Like, that's what the party leaders have decided to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're
Well, I
doing
think,
it.
yeah, that's kind of why I think, I mean, for me anyway, just as somebody who's, I mean, being invested in this is, I think one of the things that Baldwin, that's going to be a problem with Baldwin for, like why some people can't read this book is because Baldwin does talk so much about like white people. No one likes to be told how they feel or that psychological. No one likes that. Nobody likes
Right.
that. You know what I mean? It's kind of, and that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, I feel like the approach is to say to, people who are like that, like, look, you're not wrong. Okay. Lee and Grant, that's history. That's how you connect. That's fine. I just want to add to, I'm just trying to add to American history. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. And because when people start to feel people, I mean, and they're not always right, because I read, the Kennedy books, like I was, because, the whole thing, Critical Race Theory is a huge thing. So I read those big Kennedy books. I'm like, and the Coates book, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what the problem is here or what people are freaking out about. And it's not really there if you read it as a way of like, this is learning new information from perspective about American history you don't know anything about, And I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I don't, politicians want to fight because that's how they get elected, it seems to me, but it doesn't have to be a fight, That's what drives me crazy. It's like, we can talk about all these stories that make America, and as a whole, it's incredible. It's an incredible history, but yeah, it's, people have made it into a fight. So anyway, I agree with you. I just, because I deal with my family all the time where I've got Civil War buffs and all these people. And it's like, I just try to be like, yeah, let's talk about Harriet Tubman for a minute. Cause I watched this great movie on her. I read a great book on her. Like, you know what I mean? And that I feel is a better approach than like attacking or I don't know. And Baldwin gets pretty aggressive, which I like as a reader.
Yeah.
But I feel like that also limits the political possibilities of his ideas sometimes, because people are going to point to one part of his book and say, well, he's racist against white people, even though he's not, if you really read him critically.
You're
but
right.
there are passages, I could cherry pick passages and say he's racist, and people are going to do that.
Sure.
So.
But yeah, they're going to get mad early on and just stop reading. Yeah,
right.
Like they're not going to give them a chance.
And that's a struggle with this book. But
yeah.
Anyway, you just got to open people's minds a little bit at a time, I guess, is all I can think to do. But
yeah,
that's a good point, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think, I mean, I've often thought of that with any fundamentalist religion, is when families won't let their kids learn about certain things. And I think if you feel so strongly about your religion, why would you be threatened by learning this other stuff? Why, is it that fragile? And I guess that's what it comes down to with the racism, that I'm always questioning with people is, why are you afraid to entertain the idea that you could be racist? I mean, if you grow up in our culture, you have racist beliefs, whether you want to own them or not, because of the way that our culture is made up. You don't have to practice them, but you have to be aware of them in order to stop them. And I think that's the part that I find so confusing. Like, why is this so threatening? And I guess it's threatening because ultimately, if you tie your power to your white identity, and somebody wants to attack that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the point Baldwin makes. He says, this is threatening to their identity because, and I think you hear it a lot. People kind of almost say this accidentally. It's like to give other people equality to many white people. It's like, that means I have to give something up.
Right.
If these people are going to rise up, then I have to be lowered in order for this exchange to work. you know, and that's what they're afraid of. But it's like, no, you don't really have to. Your position doesn't necessarily have to change. It's just everybody else is going to be brought up to your level, and we're all on the same level. It's not really a loss, but it's viewed that way by a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of, and I'll just segue quickly. So our next book is Untamed by Glennon Doyle, and it's quite good. I hope you guys will join us. It's a very, she talks about racism, she talks about misogyny, she covers a lot of stuff. And actually, she has a great example. I don't know if it's hers or not, or if she just quotes it, but she talks about white privilege as being born on third base. You know, and then righteous white privilege is feeling like you're born on third base and you deserve to be there. You know, like you're entitled to be there.
Yeah.
So anyway, but it's quite good, and Laura Debenham is going to facilitate that conversation. So it should be a robust conversation. There's a lot. She covers a lot, and there's short little. Each chapter is just a short, very short kind of little essay, and so. It's a pretty easy read. So I hope you guys will join us for that. And is there anything else, last things you want to say, Sam?
No, that was pretty much
Thanks,
it.
Sam.
I think we covered everything. Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. And yeah, it was great. We'll see you next month.
Yeah.
Good talking, guys.
Yeah,
Have a
and
good night.
I put the link in there for the On Being. I don't know if you saw that, Ethan.
Oh yeah, thanks. I'll open that up right now so I don't lose it.
Yeah, if you want to open that up, and that's the link for the transcript. But yeah, I'd be.
Yeah,
like I said,
thank you for that.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit. If you find out more about him, share it, because I'm curious to know.
We'll do.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have
Good
a
night.
great evening.
Have a good weekend.
Okay. Bye-bye.